But what has gone wrong? That's the next problem. You see, according to, again, Smith and Koch, they said because the West took science and rational investigation further than any other civilization, inspired, by the way, largely by a Christian desire to celebrate and understand God's creation, it was the first to move towards a secular society. This is high irony indeed, that the very investigation of the world, based on the belief that it was God's creation, could so be twisted and distorted into turning our society as it is now into a largely secular society. Now, how did that happen? Now, here's a brief history of it, a very brief history of it, as it is often put to us. First of all, Copernicus moved the earth from the center of creation, and then through advances in celestial mechanics, Newton in the 17th century reduced, in the opinion of some, not in Newton's opinion, God to a kind of celestial deistic clockmaker. And then Darwin removed the special status of humans as made in the image of God and demoted them in the eyes of many people to animals made by unguided natural processes. And in a sense, Nietzsche then completed the process by announcing the death of God. So science had finally demoted and banished and even buried God. And it was from there that I got the title for my first book, arguing that science had not buried God. My book is called God's Undertaker. So that's the perspective, very roughly speaking. It has to be nuanced a great deal, from the perspective of one of the major players. But there are more major players than one. There is culture, political and cultural change. Now, Melanie Phillips, whom I know, is a Jewish commentator and a columnist for the London Times, who's always well worth reading.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that Western secularization arose paradoxically from a Christian-inspired commitment to scientific inquiry, and I find this diagnosis both ironic and accurate. This is one of the most important insights of the entire lecture. Science did not arise in opposition to Christianity, but because of it. The belief in an ordered, intelligible creation grounded rational investigation. I agree with this analysis because it exposes a category mistake, mistaking methodological naturalism for metaphysical naturalism. When science forgets its philosophical roots, it begins to overreach. The irony is that the very tool designed to explore creation was weaponized to deny its creator. This story is often presented as inevitable progress, but it is not neutral history. It is interpretation. Copernicus did not deny God. Newton did not reduce him to irrelevance. Darwin did not logically eliminate human dignity. I agree with the speaker's implication that these conclusions were imposed, not required. The leap from scientific description to metaphysical denial is unwarranted. Declaring the death of God says more about cultural desire than scientific necessity. The metaphor of science as God's undertaker is rhetorically powerful but intellectually weak. Science answers questions of mechanism, not meaning. I agree with this rebuttal because conflating scientific success with metaphysical authority is a category error. Scientific explanation does not exhaust reality. Declaring God dead is not a scientific conclusion, but a philosophical assertion disguised as one. Reducing secularization to science alone is historically dishonest. Culture, law, and politics shape belief far more than laboratories. I agree with this broader framing because it accounts for coercive and institutional pressures. Worldviews change when power structures reward certain beliefs and punish others. Ignoring this dimension leaves the analysis incomplete.
And she says in her book, Turning the World Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth, and Politics. Here's what she says. The principal characteristic of Western modernity is freedom of thought and expression and the ability to express dissent. The 18th century Enlightenment ushered in the modern age by breaking the power of the church to control the terms of the debate and punish heresy. Church and state were separated, and a space was created for individual freedom and the toleration of differences, the essence of a liberal society. Sounds great, yet, she goes on, the French Revolution and the terror unleashed by it presented the inescapable evidence that the Enlightenment, far from consigning murderous obscurantism to the dustbin of history, contained powerful strands from the start, interesting point, that would merely secularize tyranny. Now, with communism and fascism both defeated, the West has fallen victim to a third variation on the theme of totalitarianism. Not religious or political this time, but culture. So what is cultural totalitarianism? It's rule by the subjective individual freed from all external authority and constraints. Medieval Christianity, she writes, like contemporary Islamism, stamped out dissent by killing or conversion. Western liberals do it by social and professional ostracism and legal discrimination, which I suspect some of you have already experienced. And the Grand Inquisitors are to be found within the intelligentsia, in the universities, in the media, and in the law. And that brings us right to the modern climate of uncertainty. As the poet Robert Browning said, we have moved from an age of faith diversified by doubt to an age of doubt diversified by faith. I'll say that again. We have moved from an age of faith diversified by doubt to an age of doubt diversified by faith. All attempts to include reference to God or even the vast and far-reaching Christian heritage of Europe in the EU Constitution were rejected in spite of the objection of quite a few countries when it was being set up. And the EU is now left with a constitution from which the word God is entirely absent. A situation, I am very sad to say, was strongly supported by this country. As a result, Christianity is being marginalized, and atheism is becoming the preferred belief system for many people in Europe. Hence, of course, the uncertainty, because we've lost the central anchors, the pivots on which life, morality, faith in God turned for centuries. And we're now out alone in the void.
In the dialogue above, the speaker relays Melanie Phillips's argument that Enlightenment ideals contained latent authoritarian tendencies, and I find this warning historically warranted. The Enlightenment promised liberation, but it did not abolish tyranny. It rebranded it. I agree with this critique because revolutions driven by abstract ideals often become violent when reality resists theory. The French Revolution demonstrated that removing religious authority does not remove fanaticism. It merely relocates it. Reason, unmoored from moral restraint, can become brutal. This is not tyranny by force, but by exclusion. I agree with this analysis because silencing dissent through shame and professional ruin is still coercion. The absence of physical violence does not equal freedom. When acceptable belief is enforced socially, conformity replaces conscience. This produces fear, not tolerance. Doubt once existed within a framework of meaning. Now meaning exists only as a tolerated anomaly. I agree with this observation because skepticism has become the default virtue. Faith is no longer assumed rational, it is assumed suspicious. This inversion destabilizes identity and erodes confidence. Uncertainty becomes permanent. Removing God from public foundations does not create neutrality. It creates a vacuum. I agree with this reasoning because moral and legal systems always rest on ultimate assumptions. When transcendence is excluded, nothing remains to anchor meaning. The result is not liberation, but drift. A society without shared moral reference points fragments under pressure. This section shows that the West's crisis of trust does not originate from science itself, but from the misuse of science as a philosophical and political instrument. When science is forced to assume the role of religion, it becomes a thin and impoverished belief system. At the same time, culture and politics have replaced truth with expressive power. The result is a society saturated with skepticism yet lacking direction. Faith has not been defeated by reason, but sidelined by cultural power.
It's even more complicated than that. Douglas Murray, in a book that excoriates the current woke mentality particularly, and analyzes with a very clear eye the situation that you and I are now encountering in the West, he describes, and his main point really is, how the West is tearing itself apart in a way that no other great power or culture is doing to itself, with the result that the West is permeated by uncertainty and is leaving itself highly vulnerable. The West is currently assailed by its own academics. Some of them are living pretty near to this building, teaching that its own history is one of unmitigated oppression, for which it must repent. Oppression that was aided by religion, Christianity in particular. And he goes on to say, the critics of Western civilization venerate every culture so long as it's not Western. I think that's well worth thinking hard about. Let me say it again. The critics of Western civilization from inside the West venerate every culture so long as it's not Western. And he adds, in spite of all the unimaginable abuses perpetrated in our own time, at this moment by the Communist Party of China, particularly in Xinjiang, I'm adding that, almost nobody speaks of China with an iota of the rage and disgust poured out daily against the West from inside the West. Now that, to my mind, is a very perceptive thing. We live in a part of the world that's tearing itself apart. And we're called to be salt and light, to reverse this trend. And one of the major purposes of our gathering together here in Oxford is to do that and to inspire you and all of us to get involved in the discussion. Now, Douglas Murray hastens to add this. There's no doubt that terrible things have been done by religion, but two things regularly get suppressed. Firstly, that these academics have the freedom to write what they write because they have often been educated by an education system that owes its existence and freedoms to the Christian worldview. Now that's crucially important. And they ignore, suppress the fact, historically, that atheism, especially in the 20th century, has been responsible for much more violence or death than Christianity. If you want to read an expanded treatise on the effect of atheism, it's well worthwhile having a look at the Black Book of Communism. And yet, ignoring these facts, there are powerful voices still following in the wake of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, attempting to marginalize any public profession of religion, especially Christianity. And that's coming strongly from in the West. They do it in the name of science, aided by the Humanist Manifesto, which insists that religion must not have any impact on society as a whole, politics, economics, education, morality, or any other aspect of public life. So the implication is you must not do God in public. You keep quiet. If you want to believe in God, do it quietly, please, in private, but don't do it in public. But it also leads to the totally erroneous idea that religion, specifically Christianity, has nothing to do with facts, only with opinions, and therefore must be actively opposed as an irrational illusion, if not a delusion.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that Western civilization is being undermined primarily by its own intellectual elites, and I find this assessment both disturbing and difficult to dismiss. Civilizations usually defend their foundational narratives. They do not relentlessly indict them. I agree with this argument because self-critique becomes self-destruction when it lacks proportionality. Teaching an entire civilization as nothing but oppression erases moral complexity. It also dissolves gratitude for the freedoms that enable such critique. This creates a culture trained to despise itself rather than reform itself. Selective outrage is not moral seriousness. It is ideological bias. I agree with this critique because genuine moral judgment applies consistent standards. The reluctance to condemn non-Western abuses exposes that the issue is not justice, but narrative control. Western societies are condemned precisely because they permit self-critique. This paradox is rarely acknowledged but deeply consequential. The call to be salt and light is not a call to domination, but preservation. I agree with this framing because withdrawal guarantees decline. Moral silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. Engagement rooted in humility and truth offers resistance without coercion. This approach contrasts sharply with ideological enforcement. Criticism without historical honesty is propaganda. I agree with this point because freedoms do not arise spontaneously. The university system, free inquiry, and conscience protections grew within a Christian moral framework. To deny this origin while exploiting its fruits is incoherent. Gratitude is not censorship, it is intellectual integrity. This is not an argument against atheists, but against ideological amnesia. I agree with this critique because historical data matters. When God is removed, the state or ideology often takes his place. Absolute power then demands absolute obedience. Ignoring this record distorts moral accounting. Belief systems do not vanish when hidden, they are replaced. I agree with this analysis because excluding religion from public discourse does not produce neutrality, it enforces secular ideology. The claim that religion concerns opinions while secular ethics concern facts is philosophically incoherent. All moral claims rest on faith assumptions. Suppressing one worldview while promoting another is not tolerance. This section exposes a dangerous paradox. The West is using the very values born of Christianity to dismantle its own foundations. Cultural totalitarianism does not require violence. It only needs control over language, reputation, and opportunity. When history is rewritten as an indictment, society loses its capacity for self-defense. Faith is not defeated by argument, but shamed into silence.